Hello and welcome to Read. Today I have the first of three videos on Samuel Beckett's trilogy. I have spent basically the last month going through and reading Molloy, Malone Dies, and The Unnameable. Originally I planned to read one, make a video, read one, so on, and but then I read Molloy, liked it, went on and read a bit of Malone Dies and sort of realized that there was a lot of similarities, a lot of similar themes, and so I decided to just read the whole thing and then I'm going to smash out and make still three different videos. But now that I've read all of them, I am glad that I read all of them because I can see that there is some important crossovers and some themes, and although I'm going to try and be strict with keeping it like keeping each video focused on one book, I might occasionally mention and reference other parts. But quick background or setup on my relationship with Samuel Beckett, or Samuel Beckett's work, obviously not Beckett the person, but because for those who've seen the channel, you'll know that I am a fan of Joyce, but I am also a fan of those who came after Beckett, so like Donald Barthelme and some of the postmodern schools. So I knew I'd been almost circling around avoiding Beckett for a while because I knew how important Beckett was going to be as a literary influence. And last year I did read Waiting for Godot, so I kind of knew that I was going to love him, but the trilogy really just loomed on my bookshelf for about a year, and finally I just decided it was time to actually go through and read Beckett's trilogy. And yeah, I'm glad to say that although love is maybe not exactly the right word, because the work was hard, and I'll talk about that through all three videos, but what I would say, like, Beckett's work is, or this trilogy sort of falls into a category of certain unlockers, as my brother and I refer to them, which are works that, while they're maybe not, like, sometimes they are, but they might not necessarily be the best works of all time or anything, but for us, for our artistic tastes, they are pieces of art that just like unlock new avenues and make us realize where our preference lies and how to especially go about creating our own art. So even though some of my favorite books like Ulysses or The Recognitions, they were great books, they weren't unlockers, because usually something that falls into that category is going to have some unique form related thing, and so just some examples that really like blew my mind were Pale Fire by Nabokov, The Boxman by Kobo Abe, and most recently, except for Samuel Beckett, most recently I would say Clarice Lispector's short stories were all just like serious, here's some new dimensions and some ways of thinking about not like the world, but thinking about writing and thinking about experience and artistic experience. And I'm glad to say that Beckett is probably another one. Like, I know that Waiting for Godot was, and that was just a big like fireworks in my brain. But anyway, so that was my experience with Samuel Beckett. We're going to talk now about Molloy, which is the first book in the trilogy, and part of it is going to be me just like going through, reading some examples and reading some of my annotations and talking about the ideas that they gave. But the general idea, or the premise of Molloy, is that it's set in two parts. The first part is narrated by a character who refers to himself as Molloy, and there are a couple of first setup paragraphs, but the big thing that you'll notice with the first part of Molloy is that most of it is written in one unbroken paragraph, which I know from Thomas Bernhard that unbroken paragraphs are absolutely my jam, although these unbroken paragraphs did feel different to Bernhard's, that's for sure. When we get to part two, we have a hard cut to a different character, a character named Jacques Moran, and then we start to go into his life and Moran with his son. And so one of the things I loved about it is we get introduced, on the first page or the first couple of pages, we get introduced to a couple of key or core ideas. Starting with just really the first few lines of Molloy, we get I'm in my mother's room. It's I who live there now. I don't know how I got there. Perhaps in an ambulance, certainly a vehicle of some kind. I was helped. I'd never have got there alone. There's this man who comes every week. Perhaps I got here thanks to him. He says not. He gives me money and takes away the pages. So many pages, so much money. And so Molloy is just writing, and we don't really know what he's writing about, but this man comes, takes the pages, and gives him money. We go on and we start to learn, and we do a real deep dive into Molloy, and we learn that Molloy is it's an insane amount of detail, to the point where there's this like whole 4 or 5 page segment where we're learning about how Molloy figured out how to suck on these sucking stones in his pocket, and it's just insane. Like there's no plot or anything, but you're just learning about the general movements, the general location of Molloy, until we get a kind of hard cut and we go to chapter 2. After that, when we start with Moran, there's a very different style or a different prose, and it's so obviously it's a different person. But one of the things that I love with Beckett is that it's almost like the opposite of a red herring. It's like a blue trout or something, where you're told early on that there's going to be some similarities between these people, and the main one is that Malloy says that his mother's name is also Malloy, and Jacques says that his son's name is also Jacques Moran. And so Beckett just throws those little things out there, which is like, oh, I'm going to let you see these obvious connections, and then I'm just going to worm my way in and kind of try to mess you up and make you think that you're not actually seeing what you think you're seeing, and vice versa. And I would say I picked up pretty early on that so in light of that, jumping back, you're kind of meant to wonder, is Jacques Molloy? Because the plot with Jacques is some man comes and says to him, you need to go and find out and write and learn about Molloy. And so then Jacques just ups and leaves with his son, and eventually the part 2, like the style and the writing and the prose warps and adapts until by the end you're really quickly kind of reading and seeing a lot of similarities to part 1. And so there's an idea that part 1 actually chronologically happens after part 2, and that they're the same person. What I like is that Beckett puts in those cool sort of like unanswered symbols or ideas where you really could interpret it either way. And I ended up like that multi-dimensional interpretation is something that I think was done the best in Unnameable, or The Unnameable. But let's just jump in. I'm going to start talking about I'm going to start reading some extracts and talking about more ideas specific to Molloy. So something I love about Beckett is that you will get some pretty, a bit of a variety in terms of his prose style. So for example, this is like still all on the first page, where he's talking about how he kind of is becoming his mother, and starting with being in her room, but he says, I sleep in her bed, I piss and shit in her pot, and have taken her place. I resemble her more and more. All I need now is a son. And so Jacques Senior has a son from part 2, but we'll get to that. But then later on, a couple pages later, we get a really nice prose example. But now he knows these hills, that is to say, he knows them better, and if ever he sees them from afar, it will be, I think, with other eyes. And not only that, but the within, all the space one never sees, the brain and heart and other caverns where thought and feeling dance their Sabbath, all that too quite differently disposed. And something I like, this again comes in pretty prominently in The Unnameable, but there are some parts where you just are reading lines and you're like, is this Samuel Beckett talking? Is this still the character? And this is something where Beckett writes, or it is written in Molloy. And what was I doing there, and why come? These are things that we shall try and discover, but these are things we must not take seriously. There is a little of everything, apparently, in nature, and freaks are common, and I am perhaps confusing several different occasions and different times, deep down in my dwelling. Oh no, not deepest down, somewhere between the mud and the scum. And yeah, here's another thing. So with this just sort of messed up relationship that Molloy has with his mother, or the concept of his mother, and it, again, if you're using the framework of Jacques Senior and Jacques Junior in part 2, and seeing this sort of toxic relationship, something that comes up more than once is that the character or the narrator believes that he was born through his mother's ass. And so he writes, unfortunately, it is not of them I have to speak, but of her who brought me into the world through the hole in her ass, if my memory is correct. First taste of the shit. We were so old, she and I. She had had me so young that we were like a couple of old cronies, sexless, unrelated, with the same memories, the same rancors, the same expectations. She never called me son, fortunately. I couldn't have borne it. But Dan. I don't know why. My name is not Dan. Dan was my father's name, perhaps. Yes, perhaps she took me for my father. I took her for my mother, and she took me for my father. Dan, you remember the day I saved the swallow? Dan, you remember the day you buried the ring? I remembered. I mean, I knew more or less what she was talking about, and if I hadn't always taken part personally in the scenes she evoked, it was just as if I had. I called her Mag when I had to call her something, and I called her Mag because for me, without my knowing why, the letter G abolished the syllable ma and, as it were, spat on it, better than any other letter would have done. And of course, if you just go back and look at Dan, like Dan is just da, but with an N added to the N. So it is in the tranquility of decomposition that I remember the long confused emotion which was my life, and that I judge it, and as it is said that God will judge me, and with no less impertinence. To decompose is to live too, I know, don't torment me, but one sometimes forgets. This is a phrase where this almost comes back in full blossom in The Unnameable, where you get, I'll just read a little bit from further back. And even my sense of identity was wrapped in a namelessness often hard to penetrate, as we have just seen, I think, and so on for all the other things which made merry with my senses. Yes, even then, when already all was fading, waves and particles, there could be no things but nameless things, no names but thingless names. And that, like, ABBA just comes... It is so prominent in The Unnameable, and it kind of climaxes to the very end in a really just incredible way. I love this. This is one of the sentences I sent to my brother, because we love when this sort of odd or non-Euclidean syntax is something I joke about, where it's almost like there's circles in the syntax and the sentence leads into itself. And there's 2 examples in this book. I hope I remember and find the other one, but one of them is, precautions are like resolutions to be taken with precaution. This is one of the rare times I very rarely write text in a book, but this was something where the descriptions and the narrator described himself in a way that, like, just the image that was coming into my head was James Joyce. And because I know about that relationship with Joyce and Beckett, he's talking about having a walking stick, he's talking about just a general dress, and then he also mentions that of my 2 eyes, only one functioned more or less correctly. And then what surprised me was that on the next page, we actually have Ulysses mentioned, just the character, not the book, but, it's still Ulysses. And then 1 or 2 sentences later, he ends a sentence with futile wake. And just seeing, like, Ulysses and wake in sort of, the same peripheral vision on a page just kind of made me start to think again about this tormented father-son relationship. There's a sentence that made me see where maybe John Barth got some inspiration. Oh, there's a couple of sentences actually, just to set it up. It's the last sentence that I highlighted. So that I would have hesitated to exclaim, with my finger up my asshole, for example, Jesus Christ, it's much worse than yesterday. I can hardly believe it's the same hole. I apologise for having to revert to this lewd orifice. 'Tis my muse will have it so. We've now jumped into part 2, and we're narrating from Jacques, and Jacques is talking about just the experience of becoming an adult, and he writes, "My life was running out, I knew not through what breach. But I was not made for the great light that devours. A dim lamp was all I'd been given, and patience without end to shine it on the empty shadows. I was a solid in the midst of other solids." This is the other example of a sentence with some kind of odd syntax. "It seemed to me that all language was an excess of language." I like that Jacques openly talks about the different concepts of Molloy, where Jacques says, "The fact was there were 3, no 4 Molloys. He that inhabited me, my caricature of same, Gabers," Gaber is the man who comes to solicit Jacques' services to go and learn about Malloy. And finally, "the man of flesh and blood somewhere awaiting me." This is the first very explicit idea or reference of Beckett showing his face, because he writes, and this is just the narrator, but "Oh, the stories I could tell you if I were easy. What a rabble in my head, what a gallery of moribunds, Murphy, Watt, Yerke, Mercier, and all the others. I would never have believed that. Yes, I believe it willingly. Stories, stories. I have not been able to tell them. I shall not be able to tell this one." So one of the things that's a little bit like kind of throws a spanner in the works in terms of, is Malloy Jacques Jr., Jacques Sr.? Jacques Jr. Gets the bike that Malloy is riding in the first one, but Jacques Sr. Starts to lose his teeth, and so then we kind of remember the explicit sucking stones, and yeah, again, it's just this kind of warped idea of father and son being the same thing. Near the end, we've got Jacques getting really, or Moran getting really into like the same sort of neurotic idea or like hyper focus that Molloy did, where he's talking about all different ways and permutations of wearing his shirt. Again, we're just slowly seeing this like this warping into the character. And then finally, just to have this like unreliable narrator, this is the final lines, the final couple of lines. Jacques goes to the house and says, "Does this mean I am freer now than I was? I do not know. I shall learn." Then I went back to the house and wrote, "It is midnight. The rain is beating on the windows." It was not midnight. It was not raining. And so "it was midnight, the rain was beating on the windows" was also the first lines of the second part. So again, just like ending the whole thing, just saying, unreliable narrator, rethink what you were thinking and kind of go back and reassess. All in all, a very pleasurable experience. Reading Beckett is a little bit like needing to get into a state of meditation in order to actually focus on and comprehend what is even happening, because if you don't, then your eyes will just so easily start skimming, and you'll almost start hearing the voices on the page as like a background voice in your head that you're able to ignore and get distracted from. And then I feel like in The Unnameable, that almost becomes a quality of its own in the book. But yeah, and I'm not trying to say that like it was easy for me to read it. Like that was the struggle with reading this book, was just constantly finding out that I'm like, oh, my mind has just been drifting, and I've read a page, and just need to kind of jump back up and try and reread it. But I would say, in terms of if you should read if you should read any of these books, basically read the first 5 pages, and if you don't already, it's not that you have to love it, but if you don't already see like this is exactly what this book is going to do for me, and you're not on board for it for another, I guess 200% or 200 times, then yeah, you probably don't have to read it. But yeah, I mean I loved it. Fans of my channel will know that I'm a fan of like the postmodern stuff. So maybe if you're already a fan of people like Bartholomew, Corbo Abe, and so on, then it could be for you. But yeah, thank you for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. Stay tuned. I am going to make some videos on Malone Dies and also The Unnameable, so look out for that. And yeah, I'll see you all in the next videos.